Assalamualaikum second year students. I hope you are doing well with the video lectures and you have done good in your tests. Today we are going to continue our study of the novel Goodbye Mr. Chips, and this is chapter number 10 which I'm going to do with you. Now in this chapter number 10, Mr. Chips we are told that Mr. Chips had become the acting head of the school after the death of Mr. Meldrum. Now, you may be asked, who was Mr. Meldrum? Now, Mr. Meldrum, he was the headmaster of the school who had succeeded Mr. Weatherby as the head of school, Brookfield. He held the post for 3 decades and Chips had very good relations with him. After his sudden death from pneumonia in 1900, Mr. Chips was made the acting head of the school. Okay, and we are also told in this chapter that there was not the faintest chance, there was not the least chance of the governors making Mr. Chips acting appointment as the head of the school permanent. Okay, so Mr. Weatherby was succeeded by Mr. Meldrum, and after the death of Meldrum, it was Mr. Chips who was made the acting head of the school. So, who was Meldrum? Meldrum was one of the headmasters of the school, Brookfield, who served Brookfield as the head after the death of Mr. Weatherby for 3 decades, and he had died from pneumonia in 1900. And it was after his death, Mr. Chips was made the acting head of the school. Then we are told in the chapter that Mr. Meldrum was succeeded by a younger science graduate, Mr. Ralston, as the head. So Mr. Ralston, so you may be asked in exams, who was Ralston? Yeah, who succeeded Meldrum as the head of school? You may answer it as Mr. Ralston, a 37 years old science graduate with distinctions with first and blues, succeeded Mr. Meldrum as the permanent head of the school. Why this permanent head? Because acting head was Mr. Chips. He was such a kind of person who could bring the big hall to silence by the mere lifting of an eyebrow. So he was a strict person. Got it? Now, what was announced by Ralston on a May morning? Now, Mr. Chips, remember, Mr. Chips used to recollect. He used to remember the past, and right now he is recollecting the time period of Mr. Ralston's headmastership of Brookfield. And we are told that this period was studded with memories. There was a lot that was happening in England around that time. So one May morning, an important announcement was made by Mr. Ralston that Mr. Chips remembered. Now, what was that announcement? So you may be asked, what was announced by Ralston on a May morning? The answer could be, on a May morning, after everyone was summoned, was called in the big hall by the clanging of bell at an unaccustomed and an unusual time. The new head of school, Mr. Ralston, sorrowfully announced the sudden demise of the king, the sudden death of the King Edward VII. Mr. Ralston also declared, also announced, also said that there would be no school that afternoon, but a service would be held at 4:30 in the chapel. So, this was what happened on a May morning. Then, during this time, railwaymen had gone on strike. So, railway strike and Brookfield. But what happened? What was the connection between railway and Brookfield? Railway strike and Brookfield. Again, there could be more than one questions. So I have written down What duty did Brookfield students perform during the strike by the railwaymen? Now, when the railwaymen were on strike, Brookfieldians, the students of Brookfield, they had assumed voluntary work. They have started performing volunteer duties. What were those duties? Now, the most important was they or the duty which they had taken up was patrolling of the railway lines. They were patrolling the railway lines and being young boys, they considered the whole scenario, the whole situation, the strike, a great fun. So they were being entertained, they were being amused by the situation on one hand, and on the other hand, they were performing a serious duty as a citizen, as students that was of guarding, that was of patrolling the lines. Now, what was the situation? Another question that could be asked was, what was the situation of railways during the strike? So what was the situation of railways? Who was driving the railway? Were the rail cars, were the trains stopped, were they were not functioning, they had stopped functioning, or what? Now, the answer is, when the railwaymen were on strike, the soldiers were driving the engines. Since the rail strikers were not happy with this, so they were pelting, they were throwing stones at trains. And volunteers like Brookfieldian students, they were patrolling. Okay, so Brookfieldians were patrolling the lines, the railwaymen were on strike. Okay, and in this scenario, we are introduced a character, Cracklet. Now, who was Cracklet? Cracklet, we are told, was a young student of Brookfield who had asked Chips what should he do if he met a striker. He was talking about them as they were queer, strange animals out of zoo. So Craighead was a young student and he was maybe upset by the situation. He was nervous. He could not make out what's going on. He could not make out whether the strikers were good men or evil men. As they were on strike, they were not driving the engines, as they were and they were pelting thrones at the trains. So this boy, he approached Chips and asked him an innocent question: what should he do if he by chance meet a striker? And what was the response given to Cracklet by Chips? Miss Chips, who was in charge of Brookfield students patrolling lines, was talking to a man at the time when Cricklet approached him with his query about the strikers. In response, Chips had asked Cricklet if he would wish to meet a striker, and then he had introduced Mr. Johns, the signal box in charge at the railway station, saying the boy had put his life in the hands of Johns many a times. Okay, so Chips' response was that of introducing Cricklet to one of the strikers, showing him that the strikers were very much men like them. They were very much human like them. They were not unkind. They have saved the lives of people, or they had taken care of the lives of the people traveling by train. But Cricklet was a young boy. He took it as something strange. Okay, so Mr. Chips introduced Cricklet to a striker. Then, uh, then apart from strike, there were other things that were happening during during that period, and Chips had taken during this period, Chips had taken during the headmastership of Ralston. Chips had taken chap 3 to London once. Now you may be asked why he had taken chap 3 to London. Well, the answer is he had taken her to London to see the procession of the Diamond Jubilee of Queen Victoria. Now, Queen Victoria, she was old and a legendary lady. And when they saw her, she was sitting in her carriage and she appeared to them as a crumbling dawn. And though she was old, though she was rather very old, Yet she was a symbol of many things. She was a symbol of Victorian England, England that seemed to be coming to an end like her life. So Kevin Chips had taken Catherine to London to witness the procession of Diamond Jubilee of Queen Victoria, in which Queen Victoria herself appeared in her carriage. Got it, girls? Yes. Then, after the rule of Queen Victoria, came the decades during which King Edward ruled England. Regarding Edwardian decade, we are told that the decades, the era of King Edward's rule was like an electric lamp. Just like an electric lamp goes brighter and whiter before it burns itself off. Just like a bulb becomes brighter and whiter before fusing. This was the case of Edwardian decade. During this period, much had taken place. There were strikes. We are told about the failure strike. Okay, we have just read about it. Then there were lockouts. There were champagne suppers on one hand. The people were celebrating. On the other hand, there were marchers. Who were these marchers? They were protesting. They were protesters. They were protesting against their unemployment. Then there were Chinese labor. There were tariff reforms, Home Rule for Ireland, and much more that was taking place during the frenzied time period of Edward's rule. Then, apart from Cricklet, who had questioned Chips about his meeting with the railway striker, we are introduced with yet another student of Mr. Chips. That was Grayson Jr. Now, who was Grayson Jr.? You may be asked, who was Grayson Jr.? Grayson Jr., we are told, was a quite nervous boy and he was a Chips student at Brookfield. His father was on the ship Titanic that sank. Luckily, his father was rescued, and Grayson Jr. Was greatly disturbed and could not pay attention to his lesson till this news of his father's rescue arrived. Chips had greeted him when the news arrived. However, we are told, ironically, years later, it was Grayson Sr. with whom Chips had to condole the death of Grayson Jr. because Grayson Jr. had died in the war. So, this was Grayson Jr. You must know about Grayson Jr. With this, we come to the end of chapter number 10, students. Now, there is a big list of words which you have to prepare. These words, I have listed them over here on this side. It's better for you to take down these words on your notebook and write down their synonyms, memorize them. The very first word is succeed. Now, what is the meaning of succeed? Mr. Meldrum succeeded whereby, or Mr. Ralston succeeded Mr. Meldrum. What does it mean? Succeed means come after. Okay, to follow, to come after. Then there was the faintest chance of the governors making Mr. Chips' appointment permanent. What is the meaning of faintest? Faintest means slightest, weakest, smallest. Okay. Then successor. What is the meaning of successor? Successor means heir, inheritor. H-E-I-R, heir or inheritor. For glittering. The degrees of Miss Ralston were glittering with blues, first in blues. Glittering means shining, sparkling. Ferocious. Ferocious means cruel, brutal. Studded. Studded means decorated. Unaccustomed, as I told you, unusual, uncommon. Pontifical. Now, this word has been used with reference to Ralston. is pontifical, Mr. Ralston's pontifical tone. Pontifical means authoritative, forceful. It reflects Mr. Ralston's personality as well. He was an authoritative headmaster. Pontifical, for authoritative, forceful. Assemble. Assemble means together. Then catastrophic. Catastrophic means disastrous. Disastrous. Epoch. Epoch means age. Decade means 10 years. Epoch means an era, age, एक दौर. Construe. Construe means to explain. To explain. Summon. Summon means summon are usually court's order sent to someone with instruction to attend the court's proceeding. So summon means to call. Presage. Presage means to show that something unpleasant will happen. To show that something unpleasant will happen. To show that something unpleasant will happen. Flesh and blood. Flesh and blood is a phrase which is used to mean nature. Steer. Steer means to direct, to guide. Crumbling. Crumbling means crumbling. You are familiar with crumbs, breadcrumbs. So crumbling is from crumbs. Crumbling means breaking into smaller pieces. Small pieces. Frenzied. Frenzied means frantic. Frantic, yeah, wild. Preoccupied. Preoccupied means lost in thoughts, engrossed. Okay, then condole. Condole means to extend sympathy. To extend sympathy on one's loss. Taziyat karna. Queer. Queer means strange, odd. Decade, 10 years, a period of 10 years. I hope students you have learned, you have understood today's lecture. Allah Hafiz. Thank you.